Ahoy there, I be Artie, and today be a mighty special day. Sorry about that. Anyway, today's a very special day, International Talk Like a Pirate Day. As a massive pirate nerd and a massive video game nerd, what better to talk about today than pirate-themed video games? How they started and what's happening with them today, all the way from Treasure Island back in 1984 to Skull and Bones this year. Let's get into it. I should probably start off with some context. Pirates have, of course, been around for quite a while, but those guys weren't too similar to what you'd think of today. In fact, our modern view of pirates almost entirely stems from Robert Louis Stevenson's classic 1883 novel, Treasure Island, which brings us on to our first game, 1984's computer game, Treasure Island. Created by, Jim and Greg, and published by Mr. Micro for the ZX Spectrum, Commodore 64 and other computers at the time, Treasure Island was one of, if not the, first pirate-themed video games to hit the markets. In the game, you'd naturally play as Jim Hawkins, the protagonist of the book, proceeding through a number of levels which, as with most other computer games at the time, were insanely difficult, requiring split-second reaction times and the willpower of Sisyphus to get past even the first level. I'd love to give a more comprehensive review of this game, but considering the fact that I'm physically unable to play it for more than a minute without the epilepsy-inducing game over screen taunting me, that's not going to happen. I'm sure the game is great though, and whether they knew it or not, Jim and Greg over here had just kickstarted a pirate video game revolution, leading to our next game from only 3 years later in 1987. Created by legendary game designer Sid Meier in 1987, the guy that would go on to make world-renowned games such as Civilization, and Civilization, Sid Meiers Pirates was not only the first game to feature his name, but also had many features which were nothing short of groundbreaking at the time, like the huge open world and various puzzles scattered throughout the gameplay. Similarly to the last one, Sid Meier's Pirates was very difficult to figure out, especially considering I couldn't find any information about controls with a keyboard instead of a joystick, so in sword fights I kinda just flailed around and hoped. It did not work out well. Pirates introduced a number of new ideas to the world of piratical video games, including open sailing on the sea, trading between outposts, naval combat, fencing, and heaps more. It is honestly amazing how much this game managed to do, considering the hardware limitations of the late 80s. If there's one game that was the most influential to the genre, it was definitely this one. That said though, we still have many more great games to go, including this next one. Developed and published by Lucasfilm Games, later renamed to LucasArts in 1990, The Secret of Monkey Island is arguably one of the defining games of the pirate genre, and the beginning of the best point-and-click series of all time. I might be a little biased, as I adore this series. This game revolves around wannabe pirate Guybrush Threepwood, who arrives at Melee Island to undertake the 3 trials and become a pirate. Immediately after he does this, though, his love interest and Melee Island governor, Elaine Marley, is kidnapped by the ghost pirate LeChuck and brought to the fabled Monkey Island. Guybrush then gathers a crew and heads to Monkey Island to find and eventually defeat LeChuck, solving puzzles along the way. Monkey Island was not only an absolute banger of a point-and-click game, it was one of the best pirate games to date. Whilst it didn't provide that raw, swashbuckling experience which Sid Meier's Pirates did 3 years before, The Secret of Monkey Island introduced witty writing to the genre, showing off pirates as much more silly, because that's what dudes with wooden legs and eye patches sailing the seas stealing booty are. Silly. This is the kind of comedic tone we'd begin to see in future games, especially those also in the Monkey Island series, which would continue to expand over the years, getting a direct sequel in 1991 and even more games in the future. One other key element of Monkey Island we'd start seeing later is the music. All of the Monkey Island games had an amazing soundtrack composed by Michael Land, and from here on out a lot of games would start placing a bit more focus on the music. I'm a big fan of Monkey Island, and it's one of the things that actually got me into pirate-related stuff in the first place. I mean, that's got to be worth something, right? Anyway, we wouldn't see any major pirate-themed releases for the next couple of years up until the new millennium. Released in 2000 and heavily based on Sid Meiers Pirates, SeaDoogs is another pirate RPG with a bit more depth and improved 3D graphics. Whilst it's definitely not the most highly rated or technically advanced game on here, there are elements of this game which would clearly lay the groundwork for future games to come. For example, the focus on role-playing elements. This game would later get a whole bunch of sequels, including a tie-in with the first Pirates of the Caribbean movie, with incredibly lackluster connections, barely featuring anything from the franchise but for the name and the ship, the Black Pearl. Not much else to say here. SeaDoogs wasn't too remarkable, but it was regardless a stepping stone to where we are today. A remake of the original Sid Meiers Pirates was released in 2004, and whilst I usually wouldn't talk about just a remake, this one is different enough that it's worth going over. Whilst the core gameplay between the two remain the same, sail around and gain money and reputation, the 2004 remake introduces enhanced 3D graphics, somewhat similar to SeaDoogs 4 years before, which allow for a much easier gameplay experience. Seriously, being able to actually interpret what's happening on screen is a game changer. It also generally streamlined a lot of the gameplay, for example swapping the confusing mess that was fencing in the original for a much more elegant system wherein you can actually see what your opponent is about to do and try to dodge it. The game also makes things easy by keeping all controls to the number pad, which you use for literally everything from sailing to fencing to dancing. This version also featured an improved soundtrack. Whilst not nearly as boppy as any of Monkey Island's music, there are a handful of good tracks in there, and it's definitely good enough to get you in the pirate mood whilst playing. Again, it would be a little while until another major contender for the spot of top pirate game would release, but when it did, oh boy, it did. The fourth major game in Ubisoft's hit Assassin's Creed series, Black Flag, was released in 2013. Featuring a vast open world, in-depth and engaging naval battles, and a multiplayer mode, and, of course, sea shanties, it was safe to say that this was the definitive piratical experience on the market, and was treated as such upon release, being nominated for a lot of awards, and winning around 20 of those. Like I mentioned, the ship mechanics were definitely the highlight of this game. Not only was sailing detailed and fun to use, the naval combat was extremely enjoyable too, allowing you to use a variety of weapons to weaken a ship before boarding them and taking them out one by one. Essentially, the naval combat was a far more in-depth and engrossing version of that from Sid Meier's Pirates 2004. And when you add all of these gameplay features to a genuinely engrossing story, you're bound to have one of the best pirate games on the market. That is, until only 5 years later, where Black Flag's throne would be usurped by what is, in my opinion, the true definitive pirate game experience. Released in 2018 by Rare, the famed developers of such games as Banjo-Kazooie and GoldenEye 007, Sea of Thieves was, and still is, one of, if not the most comprehensive pirate experiences you can buy. It expertly pulls together heaps of features from all the previous games we've seen, the open world of Sid Meiers, the comedy of Monkey Island, and improved versions of the ship mechanics of Black Flag, to name a few, and applies a fresh coat of paint to the formula. Add a multiplayer shared world into the mix, similarly to games like World of Warcraft, along with voice chat. Captain! Yeah? And you've not only got one of the best pirate games out there, but, in my opinion, one of the best games in general, though that may be my 550 hours of gameplay talking. Let me tell you, there is seriously nothing like sailing the seas with your friends, playing sea shanties whilst incredibly drunk, and finding treasure on islands. That experience is honestly something that I've only seen Sea of Thieves be able to offer. Sea of Thieves also lent a lot into the supernatural element of pirates, the folklore of giant sea monsters, ancient magic, and so on, which is something we've only really seen before in games, with Monkey Island's voodoo magic. The world of Sea of Thieves is genuinely so interesting, and there's lots of space to tell stories in it. There are even 2 books, and they're really good. Also similarly to Monkey Island, Sea of Thieves definitely appeals to that silly element of pirates, allowing players to do things like shoot themselves out of cannons. On top of that, I couldn't talk about Sea of Thieves without talking about its absolutely incredible soundtrack, composed mostly by Robin Beanland, truly breathing life into the world. The soundtrack is honestly one of the most fitting I could imagine for a pirate game. It's nothing short of incredible. Like I said, I honestly believe Sea of Thieves is the most definitive pirate game, with its ridiculous number of great elements that contribute to the theme. But Ubisoft were clearly a bit annoyed that Sea of Thieves had usurped the throne of Black Flag, and would begin working on another pirate game which would allegedly be even better than Sea of Thieves. In fact, so good that the developers described it as the first quadruple A game. Introducing Skull and Bones, which was not that at all. Skull and Bones is 2024's brand new pirate game, and let's just say the release was stormy. And that quadruple A comment did not help. The concept of Skull and Bones sounds pretty promising on the surface. It used a lot of gameplay features from Black Flag, as it was initially developed as an expansion to the game, in a new context with way more features, and a focus on gaining infamy across the seas. Unfortunately, the game lacked a lot of those features, which would make it good. For example, it was set on the ocean, and not only could you not walk around your ship, you also couldn't swim. What? You know what else? Your ship has stamina. Stamina! Do you realise how stupid that sounds? In essence, Skull and Bones just felt like a really, really stripped down version of Black Flag. Overall, Skull and Bones far from delivered on what it was promising, and it's pretty safe to still call Sea of Thieves the pirate game. Naturally, these aren't the only pirate games out there, and there are heaps more you can find all over the place, including the stealth game Shadow Gambit: The Cursed Crew, which ups the supernatural elements of pirates to 100, Salt 2: Shores of Gold, which encourages single-player exploration, and the more recent Sea Blip, which looks like an even more fleshed out version of Sid Meiers Pirates. Overall, you can see that the pirate games have had a massive evolution over the years, with each entry in the genre contributing something new that future games can improve upon. Apart from you, Skull and Bones, I think you actually took away features from the genre. Anyway, thank you very much for watching. If you've enjoyed, leave a like, subscribe, and all that jazz, and I'll see you at some point in the future. Goodbye.